Hey guys, tonight we'll step into a world both awkward and strangely familiar. The private lives of medieval people when privacy barely existed. Forget silk sheets and candlelight. For most, intimacy meant straw beds in one-room cottages, noisy inns where strangers shared the same mattress, or hurried whispers behind thin curtains. And even for nobles, there were always servants standing too close and church rules watching even closer. Tonight's journey on historian Sleepy 365 is all about what was sex really like in medieval times, and more. We'll explore the daily struggles for privacy, the endless restrictions of the church's calendar, the myths of chastity belts and bizarre remedies, and finally, the simple truth that across cultures and centuries, humans have always longed for warmth, love, and connection. If you enjoy this kind of boring history for sleep, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always comforting to see our sleepy historian community gathering from every corner of the world. So now, turn down the lights, let the hum of the night settle around you, and allow your thoughts to drift back in time with me. This is history, told slowly, gently. A story meant to ease you into rest. Imagine this. You open your eyes on a morning in the 14th century. The first light doesn't come from a clear glass window, but from a small crack in the thatched roof. A few shy sunbeams creeping in to touch a space thick with the smell of many things: wood smoke, sweat, rotting straw, and sometimes the scent of animal dung. This is what people in the Middle Ages called a home. But to us today, it might feel more like a large tent filled with everything, rather than a private place of comfort. Inside, there is only a single room. No such thing as a bedroom, living room, or a separate kitchen. All of it, all of life, gathered in one modest space, no more than a few dozen square meters. In one corner, a cooking fire. In another, a pile of compressed straw shaped into a bed. Along the wall, perhaps a wooden trough for cows or goats. And on cold nights, chickens were sometimes brought inside to keep them safe from foxes. So your morning would begin not just with the shifting of human bodies, but also with the soft clucks of hens, the murmured bleats of goats, and the mingled smell of hay and long-cured smoke clinging to the rafters. If you grew up here, you'd know that a straw bed is not a bed in the way we think of one. It's a simple wooden frame topped with a layer of straw or dry grass. At first, the straw is soft, its scent faintly pleasant. But after only a few days, it flattens, hardens, clumps together with sweat and dust. Uninvited guests, parasites, fleas, lice, begin to call it their paradise. Now and then you'd have to replace the straw, carry the old stuff out to dry or throw it to the animals, then press in a new layer. But comfort always had limits. People used to say, to sleep on straw is to wake with a small flea market in your bed. Beds were shared. Parents with young children. Grandparents nearby. Sometimes even visiting relatives or neighbors squeezed in. There were no kids' rooms, no romantic double beds. Just one bundle of bodies, tangled beneath thick wool blankets, sharing heat to make it through the skin-cutting cold of winter. In northern Europe, winter temperatures could fall below freezing. The earthen walls and thatched roofs did little to hold warmth. People believed that the breath and body heat of both humans and livestock was the most reliable fireplace they had. At night, you curled into yourself, listening to the wind slide through the door gaps, to the snorts of a cow in the dark. And in those moments, you understood privacy did not exist inside these small houses. Every act of life unfolded in front of others. Eating, resting, everyday habits, even moments of intimacy, all under one roof. If you wanted discretion, you relied on silent agreement, children facing the wall, grandparents pretending to sleep, and livestock didn't care. Privacy became a kind of luxury. In small villages, everyone knew everyone else's business. If something strange happened in the night, the whole village might know by morning. Rumors moved faster than illness. A neighbor walking past might hear your bed creak, and the next day offer a knowing half-smile at the market. To avoid that, people learned to choose their moments. Some couples waited until the children were sound asleep. Others timed things with noisy livestock to cover sounds. A lucky few had a fabric curtain around the bed, but for farmers, a bed curtain was a rare luxury, mostly found in wealthier homes. Even among nobles, privacy wasn't guaranteed. In grand castles, beds might have velvet drapes, but a servant could still be sleeping at the foot of the bed ready to help if called. Sometimes a maid would stand quietly in a corner, pretending not to see or hear. To modern eyes, this might seem strange. To them, it was ordinary. Now imagine, you come home after a long day working the fields. You step into the house. The fire is flickering low, smoke hanging in the air. Everyone's gathered close, sharing thin soup from a bowl. Then, as darkness takes over, everyone lies down together. A child turns to face the wall. Grandparents pull the blanket over their heads. The dog curls by the hearth. You lie down, listening to the crunch of straw, to the scent of dry grass and dampness. And that is the most private moment you will ever have, surrounded by your entire family, within a single room. Psychologically, many historians call this a society without silence. You are never truly alone. Even if you try to carve out a moment for yourself, there is always sound, breathing, shuffling, presence. The individual world barely exists. This stands in stark contrast to modern life, where each person often has their own room, a door that locks, square meters they call their own. And yet, in that inconvenience, there was something else, a kind of closeness. Medieval people learned to live together, to share, to accept. They were used to the crowding, to crying children, to early rooster mornings. They didn't consider it shameful, only normal. And maybe that's why those rare, quiet moments of solitude felt all the more precious. Imagine a pale grey sunset in the 13th century. The dirt road, soaked after rain, holds puddles in its ruts. A cart rolls by, leaving dark tracks behind. You, an ordinary traveller, neither knight nor royal messenger, rest your hands on your hips and look up at the wooden sign above the door, faded paint of a leaping hare, and beneath it, the innkeeper's slanted, handwritten scrawl. This place is a tavern for drinking, an inn for sleeping, and even has a corner ale house, which means, on paper, everything you need for a night's rest is here. In reality, you'll have a place to lie down. Whether it's comfortable, only the heavens know. Inside, the first breath hits you with the smell of long-trapped smoke, wet wool, fresh fermenting ale, and the sharp drift of horses from the stable next door. There's murmuring conversation, chairs scraping over dirt floors, a wooden ladle stirring stew. A blacksmith has just pulled off his gloves, leaving soot-stained prints on the table. A fabric merchant, arms wrapped tightly around her goods, half eats, half sleeps. A weary monk leans over a bowl of thin soup, rosary beads swinging from his wrist. You edge toward the counter and ask about a bed. The innkeeper, a stout woman, scans you head to toe, then taps the table. "Bed number 3's got a free half," she says. "You want the head or the feet?" You blink. A bed half empty means someone's already in it. Back then, sharing beds was normal, not out of friendliness, but because there were too few beds, too many people, and even less money. A wooden frame with a tightly packed straw mattress, a palliasse, could sleep 2, sometimes 4. Travellers paid for the right to get on the bed, not for a night of privacy. If you wanted your own room, Some places had them, but the cost was more than the inn's best soup, plus every egg in the henhouse. And even then, a room might only be a shadowed corner behind a thick curtain, partitioned by a loose wooden screen. Sounds passed freely, like wind through the doorframe. You receive a key, or rather you don't. Just a nod from the innkeeper, and a dry twig meant to prop the door shut. You carry your bag upstairs. The floor tilts slightly. Old beams groan. Every step sighs. The windows sealed shut with a wooden latch, but wind still finds its way in, carrying the dampness of evening. Bed number 3 glows faintly under a flickering wax candle, a wide wooden frame, ropes strung taut across it, a straw mattress on top. People used to joke, "Want good sleep? Tighten the ropes." Each night, someone would bend low, pulling at the tangled strings like the snapped cords of a lute, just to lift their back a little farther from the floor. No one knows if sleep tight truly began with these rope beds, but everyone understands the reason. Loose ropes mean sore backs. On the other half of the bed, a man is already sprawled, his thick cloak bunched into a pillow, boots still on, hat pulled low over his face. He snores, steady, rhythmic, like a blacksmith's hammer, on beat, relentless, tireless. You wonder who he might be, a smith, a cart driver, a fisherman, or just another traveller like you, worn out from the road and needing sleep. You set your bag down within reach, tuck your coin pouch into your shirt, slip a small knife under your pillow. Not for anything dramatic, just custom. Travellers had their own quiet rituals for sleeping beside strangers and waking with all their things. Keep your money by your chest, keep your knife by your head, hat over your eyes but ears sharp, 1 foot outside the blanket, in case you need to run. You probably won't have to run tonight, but habits are charms. You tap lightly on the edge of the bed. The man grunts, pulls up his hat, squints at you through a narrow slit. An awkward moment opens. 2 strangers sharing 1.5 meters of dry straw, a single wool blanket, and a mutual agreement of silence. He nods. You nod back. The unwritten contract is sealed. Don't steal the blanket. Don't kick. Don't put your boots near someone's face. Don't speak loudly. Don't ask too much. And if you must ask, choose questions so bland they disappear in the wind. Where are you from? Up north? Where to? South? Answers like wind through leaves. Passing, never snagging. You turn toward the wall, trying not to shift too much. The straw crinkles like a nest of mice. Downstairs the noise lingers. In taverns, nights end slower than the sun. Someone sings a countryside tune. Someone taps a spoon to the rhythm. Someone tells a story, details trimmed to sound more thrilling. Now and then, laughter bursts, sharp as a clay cup falling off a table. Then footsteps on the stairs, the innkeeper's familiar shh. A door creaks. Gradually, the sounds quiet. Only wind and the snoring beside you. But snoring isn't alone. If you're lucky, there's only one. Otherwise, you're treated to a small symphony. One snores, one wheezes, one mumbles, one grinds their teeth. Some cough, lungs worn thin by the road and smoky air. Now and then, a wooden dipper clinks in a bucket, someone drinking. Or a ceramic chamber pot scrapes softly across the floor, someone tending to needs, stealthy and shared, a secret every guest pretends not to notice. The scent of wet shoes, half-dried wool, ale, and garlic stew blends into the aroma of the night. Not pleasant, but not unbearable. It is the scent map of an era, honest, unmasked, with no perfume to soften the truth. In the dark, you realize your body is just a little too long for the bed. 1 foot touches the cold frame. The other bumps your neighbor's boot. Yes, he's still wearing them. Not out of rudeness, but because they just dried. and if he takes them off, they'll be wet again. In the morning, that would mean strapping on a swamp. And also, shoes off means shoes can disappear. In a world where sleep is a possession, people learn shoes are worth guarding. You curl your legs in, pull the blanket up to your chin. It's thick wool, a little scratchy, heavy like the promise of a new day. Outside the shuttered window, somewhere in the distance, a dog barks twice, then quiet. On the small shelf by the bed, really just a plank nailed to the wall, a wax candle burns low. The flame flickers, like a drunk swaying in the cold. You glance around. The beams above are scratched with tally marks, left by someone who stayed too long. An iron nail holds a fabric pouch. A bunch of dry grass plugs a drafty gap in the wall. Your bedmate snorts, rolls over, breathes out hard. You hear a faint rustling, the soft tick of lice nesting in the seams of the blanket. Not every night has them, but many do. Fleas and lice are the loyal guests of medieval life. They pay no coin, but they know how to choose a crowded bed. People fight them with ashes sprinkled in the straw, with herbs tucked in the bedding, or with hope. Hope that they bite someone else first. Strangely, in this damp and noisy place, sleep still arrives. Not a luxurious sleep, but the sleep of the tired. The road was long, your shoulders ache, your belly warmed by stew, eyes dry from smoke, one hand still resting on the pouch under your shirt, as if by instinct. You half hear whispers from the next bed. A couple fighting gently over a shared blanket. A soldier halfway through a story about a collapsed bridge to the south. A wandering singer humming lines that never end. Then slowly, everything fades, like the tide retreating from the shore. A night closes in, early morning. The rooster from the neighboring stable calls out, its voice bouncing off the walls. Far-off church bells summon the day's first prayers, and the faint light of dawn slips through the doorframe. The man beside you stirs. He pulls up his hat, opens his eyes. Another awkward moment, this time the awkwardness of morning. Two strangers, having shared a night in the same bed, still don't know each other's names. You nod. He nods back. The ritual repeats itself, just as before. Few words, polite distance, no one touching the other's coin pouch. Each gathers their blanket, pats down the straw, tightens the bed ropes once more for whoever will come next. Here, people don't say goodbye, they say God bless. Or simply, safe travels. Downstairs, the innkeeper has already started her morning. The stew pot is still warm from the night before. Thick slices of bread sit ready. A basin of water waits for hands to wash. The price of a shared bed is flexible. A few coins, an egg, a handful of nails, a bit of wool. It depends on the village, the season, and the innkeeper's mood. A trader might pay with scraps of cloth. A carter with a bent back and a tern stoking the fire. A minstrel pays with songs to lighten the evening. A monk gets a discount. His rosary carries favor. You place 3 small coins on the table, enough for the bed and a bowl of morning soup. The innkeeper counts them with her eyes, then slides over a piece of bread for the road ahead. Travel in those days was a slow kind of sport. 5 or 7 miles a day was considered good. From village to town you moved through a network of inns, rest stops and shelters for the poor and the pilgrim. At places meant for pilgrim. Beds were more crowded, beer less common, and prayers more plentiful. At towns near the market, there were never enough beds. Straw mats were pulled out across the floor. 1 blanket shared between 4 people. And the snoring rolled through the rafters like wind through a forest of reeds. It was all temporary, but it had its own order. There were bed-sharing rules, and yes, they existed, even if they sound absurd. Don't steal the blanket. Anyone pulling too hard would be tapped on the back. Don't hog the pillow. Pillows were rolled-up cloaks. To take one was to take someone's clothing. Don't ask personal questions. You were beside someone, not bonded to them. Don't spit on the floor. And if you had to, use the ash bucket in the corner. Ash masks odor better than water. Don't shake fleas onto others. If you must pick at them, do it on the stairs or in the backyard. Don't reach under someone else's blanket for any reason, even if my blanket drifted over there. Don't sing after the candle is out. Don't tell ghost stories unless everyone agrees, because afterward, no one sleeps, not even the storyteller. And of course, there was no privacy for couples wishing to whisper affection. Private spaces, if they existed, had to be paid for. Rarely available. Not always what one hoped. Some couples glanced at each other, smiled faintly, and waited for another night. Some quietly pulled the curtain, nodding at the innkeeper's deliberate cough. Some chose the forest over the inn. But most of the time, the road left knees more weary than hearts, and sleep came before any whispering did. In an age where peace was a luxury, sleep was a kind of grace. Along the road, you would meet all kinds of bedmates. Merchants with the scent of cinnamon hidden in their sleeves, woodsmen who carried pine resin on their coats, gardeners dusted with the smell of damp earth, wagon makers with tar on their hands, a schoolmaster whose fingers smelled of ink, a flutist who held his instrument like a child clutches a toy, a lost novice mumbling prayers in his dreams, and sometimes, the less welcome, a pickpocket with mouse-like hands, eyes sharp in the dark. With them, you didn't argue. You just tied your purse tighter, turned your back, slid your knife under the pillow, as the ritual dictated. Most of the time, nothing happened. Stories of thieves rang louder than truth. In inns across Europe, the great majority were just tired people who wanted to sleep. Some nights, the beds filled early. You'd be led to the stables. They'd tell you it was warmer there. The horse's breath kept the air heated. You'd lie on dry straw, head on a sack of hay. At first, the smell of horses was thick, but it softened, became something like a forest scent. Even the stable had its etiquette. No loud noises, no big lanterns. Horses feared the light. Don't flail your arms, you might brush against a hoof. People joke that in the stable there was less snoring, because horses don't snore. But they breathe deeply, like bellows, which could be soothing in a different way. Whether upstairs, downstairs, or in the stable, a night on the road was always a lesson in shared space. You learned how to fold yourself just enough so others had space to fold themselves. You learned when to be silent, where to whisper, how to breathe, smaller than usual. You learned to smile quietly when a stranger's boot heel landed on your foot. You learned to pull the blanket like a harpist plays a string, gently, with rhythm, never yanking. You learned to trust in silent agreements. I won't ask who you are, and you won't ask how much I carry. And in the morning, each person walked away, owing nothing but one night's shared mattress. When the sun rose over the thatched roof, you stepped into the courtyard. The road opened once again. Before leaving, you dusted your cloak, adjusted your pouch, straightened your hat, counted your coins, not from suspicion, but from habit. A way to protect the few small things that were yours in a world shared by many. The innkeeper waved, "Stop by on your way back." It wasn't just an invitation, it was a full stop to last night's story. Every night brought a new tale, and every bed was a page in the invisible ledger of those who travel. In the end, Shared beds weren't romantic, nor were they dreadful. They were simply the solution of their time. Few houses, many people, long roads, cold nights. They taught people humility in space, patience in the face of snoring, compassion for someone else's damp sleeves. They turned strangers into neighbors for just one night. And by morning each returned to their own path, like streams that briefly merge before separating again. If you ask where privacy existed in all this, the answer is in you. Privacy was no longer walls or doors, it was a skill, the ability to draw yourself into quiet, even with someone breathing at your back. The ability to keep secrets not through locks, but through silence. The ability to sleep beside a stranger and feel like nothing was taken from you. In the Middle Ages, togetherness was the default. Solitude was the luxury. And so the night's lodging, with its straw beds, rope frames, wool blankets, snores, wet shoes, and morning stew, was not just a footnote in a grand history. It was a small lesson in the shared ordinariness we modern people sometimes forget. One day, when the power's out, the Wi-Fi flickers and guests fill the house, you might unroll a spare mat on the floor, lie a little closer to one another, pull a blanket over more than one body. And if, in that moment, you hear someone snore and smile, then maybe, just maybe, you've met a sliver of the Middle Ages inside your modern home. Before leaving the inn, you glance back at the wooden sign, still swaying in the wind. The hair is still leaping in faded paint. The letters still crooked, just like the night before. One night, one bed, one stranger, all wrapped into a memory so ordinary it could almost put you to sleep. And that is the quiet beauty of everyday history. No fireworks, no triumph. Just tired people looking for a place to rest their heads before moving on. You tighten your pouch, adjust your cloak, take the first step back onto the road. The sun is still low. The mist lies over the fields like a soft blanket. The path greets you with a ribbon of dry mud, a stripe of light, and the promise that tonight, in some other inn, with some other stranger, you'll share another blanket, and sleep will come again. Steady, gentle, unhurried. And in that rhythm, medieval life moves on, slow, tight, warm, and enough. If shared straw beds in a one-room house were the default experience of medieval peasants, then at the other end of society the nobility also had their beds, carved wooden frames, velvet curtains, soft goose-down mattresses. But here's the curious truth. Even amid all that luxury, privacy still didn't really exist, and the divide between straw and feathers, between velvet drapes and thatched roofs, was not just about comfort. It was the clearest expression of what we now call the class divide. For peasants, artisans, and small families in the countryside, there was usually only one option, the palliasse, a mattress stuffed with straw. If there was a bed frame at all, it was just 4 rough boards nailed into a rectangle, sometimes propped up on stones or broken bricks to keep it off the damp ground. On top of that went coarse fabric, stuffed with bundles of tightly packed dry straw or hay. At first, the mattress was soft, the straw was new, the scent lightly sweet, the rustling sound easy to fall asleep to. But after a few weeks, the straw broke down, flattened, hardened, and clumped together. Tiny gaps formed, the perfect home for fleas and lice. People used to joke. A palliasse didn't just hold straw, it held a whole village of insects. Every few months, families had to replace the straw. It became a kind of household ritual, hauling out the old straw to burn or dry in the sun, stuffing in the fresh. Every child had tumbled in that old pile, scratching at their itches while playing. And when the new mattress was ready, the whole family took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of straw as if the entire house had been renewed. But it was still just straw. In winter, it held a bit of warmth. In summer, it quickly grew musty. No goose down, no thick wool, just a coarse cloth cover. For them, sleep wasn't for comfort. It was for gathering the strength to work again. In castles and manor houses, the picture was entirely different. A noble might sleep on what was called a great bed, longer and wider than anything a peasant would know, enough for two people to lie without touching. The frame was often oak or walnut, carved with floral motifs, sometimes even marked with a family crest. Instead of straw, their mattresses were stuffed with goose down or a mixture of bird feathers and wool. Thick, soft. When you sat down, it gave gently beneath you, as if it wrapped around the body. The outer layers were linen or velvet. Woolen blankets were woven thick. In winter, they added pelts, bear or wolf, for warmth and to display wealth. Most notably, noble beds often came with curtains, 4 tall wooden posts holding up panels of velvet or linen, sometimes embroidered with golden patterns. The curtains blocked the wind and gave the illusion of privacy. One could close them, pull the cords tight, and turn the bed into a room within a room. And for noble couples, this might have felt like one of the rare places to pretend privacy was possible. But it was still a pretense. Because in that same chamber, a servant always slept nearby, on a bench, on a small mattress, at the foot of the bed. Every night, if the lord or lady needed water or light, or to send a message, the servant had to be ready, which meant no matter how thick the curtains, no matter how soft the feather bed, movement, breath, and sound were never hidden. And here's a detail few consider. A noble's bed wasn't just for sleeping, it was where trusted guests were received. In many castles, the bedchamber was not private. Important visitors were invited in, sat on a chair beside the bed, or even on the edge of it, to speak in confidence. The bed, then, was both a piece of furniture and a symbol of power, a kind of personal throne within one's own space. In other words, the bed, something we considered deeply personal, was a public object. A bed draped in velvet, carved with symbols, edged in embroidery, wasn't just for restful sleep, it was for status, so others could see it. To us, that might feel like a contradiction. To the Middle Ages, it was simply normal. The curtain became a boundary, It marked the difference between those who could enclose themselves and those left exposed to the draught. Peasants had only straw, rough wool blankets, and the closeness of shared bodies. Nobles had velvet curtains, carved wood, and down feathers, and yet neither truly had privacy. One lacked it due to poverty, the other due to constant proximity of servants. The difference lay in perception. Peasants accepted togetherness as part of life. Nobles lived under the illusion that a curtain could hide them, even as breath, whispers, and quiet laughter slipped through the fabric. And this wasn't unique to Europe. In Edo period Japan, samurai slept in large rooms, separated only by paper screens. In imperial China, wealthy families had 8 treasure beds, elaborately framed to dazzle and conceal. In India, the rich slept on thick carpets, but the area around the bed was crowded with servants keeping silent watch. Different materials, straw, velvet, paper, wood, but the same truth. People in the past did not have privacy as we imagine it. Curtains weren't to hide secrets, they were to give the illusion of safety. And straw was not just a symbol of poverty, it was the only way to hold on to warmth. In the end, medieval beds didn't reflect sleep, they reflected class. And at both ends, the peasant in straw, the noble under velvet, they shared one simple reality. True private space had not yet come into being. Evening in a medieval village wasn't the peaceful, silent time we often imagine. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the fire in the small hearth began to flicker, smoke curling through the gaps in the thatched roof. Whispers, shifting bodies, the clink of hooves from livestock outside, all merged into a low, hazy soundscape that settled over the home. And within that murmur, privacy, or more accurately, the desire for just a sliver of it, became a puzzle with no easy solution. Every married couple knew intimate moments had to be timed just right, coordinated with the rhythm of the household and, sometimes, the rhythm of the village itself. Peasants couldn't choose a romantic hour on a whim. They lived by natural light, church bells, and the demands of the farming calendar. The day began with a rooster's crow and ended when the oil in the lamp ran out. In the short window between labor and sleep, if a couple wished to be close, they had to arrange it discreetly. Wait for the children to drift off, faces turned to the wall. Wait for the grandparents' breathing to slow, their heavy snores to settle in. Wait for the cows to bury their noses in the hay trough, for the hens to go quiet on the rafters. Sometimes the stillness of a winter night was the only curtain they had. But stillness never lasted long. The straw bed creaked with every shift. Wooden doors groaned as the wind passed through. A single bark from a dog in the yard could rouse an entire row of houses, and just one small sound was enough for others to notice. In a tiny community where every creak might become tomorrow's gossip, discretion was an art form. People learned to soften their voices, to steady their breathing, to choose their moments wisely. When rain drummed loud on the roof, when wind howled down the lanes, when the whole household collapsed into sleep after a long day cutting grass or harvesting grain, nature became their ally, a cover for human noise. Ironically, while people tried to keep things quiet, neighbors were always ready to guess. Houses stood just steps apart. Walls of packed earth were thin. Windows had no glass, just a board or hanging cloth. If someone stayed up late, they might hear laughter, murmured voices, or just the soft rustle of straw. And by morning at the village market, mischievous eyes would gleam. Half-joking comments floated by. "Busy night at your place, eh?" Rumors traveled faster than any horse, sometimes faster than disease. A single sound could turn into a story, then into a parable, repeated by the priest in Sunday Mass, not just in villages, even in inns, where travelers paused for the night. Privacy was still just an illusion. Beds were shared with strangers, bodies tucked under coarse blankets. In that setting, any private act had to be stifled. No one wanted the stranger beside them to notice, because even a whisper could become a tale that trailed you from one town to the next. They used to say, in cheap inns, check the bed first, not just for fleas, but to see if someone else had already taken it. In such places, a glance, a cleared throat, could be the line between secrecy and exposure. Among nobles, the situation wasn't much better. Even with large beds, heavy velvet curtains, and solid stone walls, they were never truly alone. A servant always waited at the foot of the bed. Sometimes a maid slept in the corner. Whatever happened behind the curtain could be pretended unheard, but everyone knew. And when secrets from upstairs slipped into the ears of those downstairs, they became kitchen gossip by morning. In the closed communities of the Middle Ages, the private could easily become public, and so many couples developed a kind of secret language to set their appointments. A glance held just a moment too long, a gentle touch while fetching water, a phrase dropped casually over supper. These were the signals, a silent understanding that once the house was asleep, they would try to steal a moment. Sometimes even that had to be postponed. A child fell ill, a guest arrived without warning. The church bell rang early, calling the faithful before dawn. Any one of these could undo a fragile plan, but maybe that fragility was what made those moments so precious. A quiet night, with neighbors too busy to care, rain tapping loudly on the roof, children deep in sleep. Suddenly the whole world seemed to conspire in their favor. Secrecy became not just instinct, but strategy, an art of survival, in a world with little space for private lives. And when we look back, we might notice something gentle beneath the hardship. Human beings, no matter the era, have always tried to hold on to intimacy, to connection, not just the physical need, but the emotional one, to be comforted, to belong. The rustle of straw, a whispered word in the dark, a laugh quickly stifled. They're all reminders that even in cramped, crowded places, people found a way to carve out a private sky for just a few quiet moments. In the tapestry of medieval life, if one-room cottages, cramped inns, and velvet-draped noble beds all spoke to the lack of privacy, then there was one place more extreme than any of them, the monastery. Here, high walls, heavy wooden doors, and endless stone corridors weren't built to shield intimacy, but to extinguish the very idea of it. The rule was absolute, repeated like scripture. You must not, you cannot, and you never will. Monks lived by the rhythm of prayer. In narrow cells just large enough for a wooden bed, a blanket, a book of scripture, and sometimes a candle. Each room was a box, not a space for the body to express itself, but a shelter for the soul. And yet, no wall is high enough to silence every echo of human instinct. History keeps record in the whispers of confessions, in the dry language of monastic chronicles noting a violation of vows by a young friar or a cloistered nun. No matter how strict the rule, no matter how many hours of prayer, humans still listen to the quiet voices within. That is why many monasteries were built more like fortresses than homes, tall walls, locked gates, rigid curfews, not just to guard against threats from without, but against softness from within. Walk the monastery hall on a winter's night, and you'd see candlelight flicker through a narrow window, hear the wind moan through cold stone cracks, and feel a silence, not gentle, but imposed. Here, intimacy isn't a privacy waiting to be broken. It's a luxury denied from the beginning. The Church taught that the soul belonged to God and the body was merely a vessel, a tool to be disciplined. Desire in all its forms was labeled sin. And the more absolute the ban, the more quietly people had to wrestle with their nature. The tall walls stood not just as signs of obedience, but as symbols of silent resistance. If we look beyond Europe, we find that this struggle with privacy was never unique to the West. In ancient China, entire generations often lived under one long roof. Grandparents, parents, children, even distant cousins slept in the same hall. Beds were wooden platforms, mats rolled out in rows. Privacy, if it existed at all, came in the form of averted eyes or a reed curtain dropped loosely from above. In a society rooted in kinship, the idea of carving out a personal space was foreign. In Japan, a different layer emerges. Ancient Japanese believed dreams held messages, sometimes from spirits, sometimes from the divine. Even erotic dreams weren't seen as personal indulgence, but as omens. In homes made of wood and paper, where shoji walls were no more than translucent screens, no one was ever fully apart from others. Yet privacy wasn't mourned, it was reframed. Dreams became part of a spiritual vocabulary. Intimacy turned symbolic. Look closely, and everywhere you find the same question asked, in 1,000 forms: how do we satisfy our inner needs without shattering the order that surrounds us? In medieval Europe, the answer was whispered in darkness, timed with the rain and wind. In China, the answer was endurance, accepting that the personal must bow to the communal. In Japan, the answer was transformation, weaving private longing into spiritual meaning. And through it all, one thing remains constant: the quiet, unyielding human desire to connect, to carve out a moment of one's own. Even behind monastery walls, even under vows of silence, people searched for slivers of closeness, a hidden glance, a hand brushed in passing, a dream left unspoken. These details, so small, so easy to miss, are what make history feel human. And perhaps the greatest lesson they offer is this: privacy was never freely given. It was earned over centuries of change. When you close your bedroom door tonight, pull the curtain, switch off the light, you are enjoying a luxury that even nobles once dreamed of. And in that peace you might smile, knowing that across the span of time, millions before you longed for the very same thing: a night undisturbed. No one listening, no one whispering, no one judging. And yet, the whispered secrets in cramped houses, the furtive glances beneath monastery curtains, those were only half the story. Because no matter how people twisted and turned to claim a sliver of privacy, there remained a force larger than them all: the church. It did not stop at the soul. The church laid its hand across the body, stretching a vast, invisible calendar over every bed. Which days were allowed, which days were forbidden, even the hours, the positions, the intentions, each one weighed, judged, recorded. To truly understand intimacy in the Middle Ages, you must step beyond hearth and chamber, pass through the church doors, open the thick ledgers of the bishops, and read the cold, deliberate lines that governed even the most private corners of the human heart. When a medieval peasant lay down on their scratchy straw mat at night, they didn't only think of the cold, the aching limbs, or the sighs of livestock sleeping just a breath away. They also had to think of a different kind of weight: an invisible calendar quietly draped over the whole house, the church's calendar. In a world where the church stood at the center of every village, where every bell dictated when to eat, when to work, when to sleep, even intimacy bowed under its watch. Today, a couple might simply choose a quiet Friday night to draw close. In the 13th or 14th century, it wasn't so simple. Nearly half the year was already marked with silent red ink: Lent, Advent, Sundays, Fridays, days of devotion, of sacrifice, of restraint, days when the soul must rise and the body must wait. Lent alone meant 40 days of abstinence before Easter. Then came Advent, another 40 before Christmas. Sundays, off limits. Fridays, also number. Wednesdays, suspicious. So if you were a devout couple, you might be left with fewer than 180 scattered days a year, rarely in a row. Intimacy reduced to puzzle pieces on a calendar made by someone else. Imagine the farmer coming home after a long spring day, aching for comfort, his eyes meeting his wife's across the firelight, only to remember it's Friday. So he turns over, pulls the blanket high, and waits. The rules weren't just preached, they were written. Bishops recorded them in thick confession manuals, lists of forbidden days, forbidden acts, cross-referenced like war strategies. Priests would ask at confession, "Did you abstain during Lent? Did you violate the Lord's Day?" Even the quietest acts were pulled into the open, measured, judged, and labeled. The irony: the more forbidden the days, the more calculated the desire. Some joked it took 3 calendars, one for the church, one for the fields, and one for luck, just to manage a night together. Intimacy stopped being spontaneous. It became a ritual, an appointment, a negotiation between bell towers and candlelight. And yet people whispered. They waited for storms to cover their sounds. They waited for midnight, for the house to still. They followed the rules, and then quietly broke them. Peasants, unable to read the bishop's Latin, heard only the sermons. They nodded, they obeyed, but behind wattle and daub, they still reached out in the dark, and they feared. The neighbor's ears, the priest's questions, a sick child born from a forbidden night. Fear led to silence, and silence made the human need feel even more fragile, even more tender. Among nobles, the weight was heavier: private confessors, moral advisors, journals where one's purity had to be recorded. A lady might draw her velvet curtain closed, but still know the priest downstairs was listening for a whispered sin. That kind of scrutiny made even warmth grow cold. But this calendar of abstinence wasn't random. It revealed a deeper theology: the soul above the flesh, the body's only true purpose, to reproduce, to serve the divine. Desire, only within limits, only in the right season. But people, poor or privileged, found ways to bend. They left behind traces, scribbled notes, rumors. A child born 9 months after Lent, with suspiciously healthy lungs. And from those whispers in the cracks of silence, we learn the truth. Even in a world ruled by bells and bishops, life still found its way forward, quietly, defiantly human. And yet, even in the hours when the church calendar finally allowed, intimacy was never truly free. Because permission came with a price: humility, restraint, and above all, no pleasure. Not too much, not too openly, and preferably not at all. This they called virtue, but in truth it turned intimacy into duty, a chore. In the guides, the sermons, the confession manuals, one idea echoed over and over. There was only one natural way, what we now call the missionary position. Husband above, wife below. A mirror of divine order, man as God, woman as the church, obedient and still. Any deviation? Suspicious at best, sinful at worst. Some priests were explicit, writing long lists of what was forbidden, naming positions, describing acts, warning of malformed children or corrupted souls if couples wandered from the narrow script. So instead of letting affection lead, people memorized rules. Instead of listening to each other, they listened to warnings. Picture a young couple, newly married, lying on a straw bed, a thin curtain barely dividing them from the rest of the household. The lamp is out, the night is quiet, but rather than draw closer, they hesitate, hearing the echo of the priest's voice. Be modest. Do not show too much desire, and whatever you do, don't be inventive. Even in the rare moment of privacy, rules seeped into the dark, turning connection into something awkward, heavy, almost comical. And in noble bedrooms behind velvet drapes and stone walls, the burden could be even worse. Some bishops kept diaries, urging noble couples to finish quickly without pleasure, without delay. Love in this view was a task, a checkbox, not a bond between two people, yet just a duty to be done and forgotten. Even joy itself was suspicious. Too much delight, too much laughter, sine. Even between husband and wife. In confession, priests asked questions that made grown men shrink. A farmer might confess to stealing a neighbor's turnip, then be asked, with startling specificity, how he lay with his wife. Moderation, they said. Always moderation. But it became a leash, not just on desire, but on intimacy itself. Some texts went as far as to recommend no eye contact, no talking, no emotion. Only silence, only duty. Today it reads as mechanical, absurd. But for the medieval mind, this was what they were taught to believe. And yet, not everyone obeyed. Some followed the rules faithfully, living lives of quiet caution. But many others, especially peasants, listened politely and then did as they pleased. They understood discretion. What happened behind clay walls and under thatched roofs, let it stay there. As long as the priest didn't hear, as long as the neighbors didn't gossip, the wind could carry away the rest. What the church called natural was just another pattern laid over people's lives. A model of power, man above, woman below. Obedience over connection, silence over feeling. But no mold can fit every soul. People still longed for touch, for closeness, for something warmer than ritual. And somehow, in whispered nights, they found it. That's why, centuries later, reading those rules feels strange, detached, out of place. They remind us life in the Middle Ages was not just war and hunger, it was also shaped by delicate, relentless rules, even in the bedroom. And within those rules, people made their quiet choices, to obey or to smile in the dark and keep a small, private piece of freedom for themselves. In medieval life, the church wasn't just where the bell rang each morning. It didn't only preside over baptisms, weddings, or funerals. It reached into the smallest corners, even the most intimate ones. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the confessional. There, in a darkened alcove of the church, a parishioner would kneel, bow their head, and whisper their sins. The priest listened, but sometimes it felt like the very room itself was leaning in to hear. And among the questions asked was always this: what happens in your bedroom? In instruction manuals for priests from the 13th and 14th centuries, entire sections were dedicated to guiding confession, not just about theft or anger or envy, but about sex, specifically marital sex. A farmer might walk in thinking to confess a flare of temper or a bundle of stolen firewood, only to hear, "When you were with your wife, did you act with restraint? Did you do anything not sanctioned by the church?" In the flickering light of the candle, privacy peeled away. And it wasn't only men, women too knelt in that hush, fingers on rosaries, asked, "Did you obey your husband? Were you modest? Did you seek pleasure too eagerly?" If the priest didn't like the answers, penance was given, more prayers, more fasting, sometimes even public rebuke. But now, imagine it. A peasant couple crammed into a mud-walled hut, struggling to feed themselves, finding rare warmth beside each other on a straw mattress, only to be summoned days later to recount that fragile moment as if it were a crime. There was a joke whispered in taverns: "The priest knows more about your bedroom than your doctor does." And it wasn't far from the truth. Surviving confessional manuals include astonishingly detailed questions. How often, on which days, with what intent? Did you enjoy it? The bedroom, the most private place, was dragged into the light. And if you crossed the line, punishment could come not just in penance, but in gossip, in isolation, in shame. This created a strange reaction. People became secretive, even creative. They timed their intimacy with care, chose nights when no one was awake, stayed utterly silent, not out of passion, but out of fear. Fear of being overheard, fear of confession, fear of punishment. And yet that tension-shaped culture, modesty in speech, restraint in gestures, even those little jokes at the tavern, where everyone knew that Father so-and-so could recite how many times a week each couple embraced. For nobles, the scrutiny was even tighter. In castles, ledgers tracked not just weddings and births, but habits, to ensure the legitimacy of heirs, to avoid scandal, to protect family honor. For peasants, it was about community judgment. For nobles, it was political. But either way, no one was spared. In the confessional box, everyone felt the same. This is no longer mine. Even my most private moments belong to the church. Some older priests, after decades of listening, became quiet experts on village love lives. They knew which couple was too enthusiastic, which was too cold, which needed correction. It sounds absurd now and a little chilling, because in those records we see a society where privacy didn't exist, where even your breath in the dark could be questioned and judged. And yet, people still lived, still loved, still bent the rules, still whispered in the dark. Even with a church that listened through walls, people found ways to keep something for themselves, and that too is history. In medieval society, the difference between nobles and peasants wasn't just about clothing, food, castles or cottages. It crept all the way into intimacy, where one class lived under the watchful eye of church and law, and the other moved with quiet flexibility, sometimes turning a blind eye to what was forbidden. If you want to understand the clearest divide of all, you only need to look at one question: who was allowed to be close to whom, and how? For the nobility, intimacy was never just personal, it was political. Marriages were arranged long before bride and groom could understand what marriage even meant. And when they did marry, privacy was still a fiction. Servants at the foot of the bed, ladies in waiting just outside the door, a priest in the castle ready to take notes or ask questions. Whether they had children or joy was less important than whether the child was legitimate. A single rumor could ruin a political alliance. One misplaced affection could spark a war. For nobles, surveillance came in layers. The law of the church, the pressure of family, and the eyes of every servant. Intimacy, more often than not, was a duty, a means of producing heirs. And if a noblewoman was suspected of losing her virginity before marriage, she might not be the only one to pay for it. Her entire family could suffer. Men had more freedom, but not absolute freedom. A wrong affair with the wrong person could bring ruin. Meanwhile, peasants lived closer to the ground, literally. One-room homes, a straw mattress, steps from the pigs. No silk canopy, no official record-keeping, no priest hovering with questions. Their intimacy happened quietly, in the dark after the children had fallen asleep, with the wind outside hiding every sound. Yes, neighbors might overhear. Yes, the priest might lecture. But the worst consequence? A few whispers in the village. By morning, everyone had gone back to the fields. Old peasants treated the church's calendar with a kind of practical reverence. On paper, half the year was forbidden. Sundays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, saint days, and so on. But in a cold winter, with little warmth and less comfort, many couples quietly skipped a rule or two. They still went to Mass, still nodded through sermons. But back home, they knew they needed each other more than they needed a saint's approval. But you could say this: nobles were bound by honor. Peasants were bound by hunger. One feared losing inheritance or public shame. The other feared losing crops, warmth, or a night of sleep. That shaped everything. Nobles approached intimacy with tension, caution, and constant fear of judgment. Peasants, with practicality, simplicity, and a touch of humor, even if it meant doing penance later. Folk tales from the time are full of jokes. One tells of a man being asked, "Did you remain pure during the holy days?" He replies, "Oh yes, Father. During the day, I did, but night was a different matter." The village laughs, the priest sighs and hands down a few extra prayers. That moment of levity shows how peasants handled the rules. Fear, yes, but also laughter and clever little ways to bend without breaking. Nobles weren't so lucky. A single misstep could become a multi-generational scandal. There are stories of countesses tried in court over rumors with no proof. Sometimes even a bedsheet without enough blood could spark lawsuits that lasted years. what seemed like minor details carried the weight of law and reputation. So the divide wasn't just wealth, it was in how rules were applied. For the poor, laws were a framework, but inside it they found room to move. For the rich, laws were chains, tight, unyielding, and constantly watched. And here lies the paradox. Those with the least power often had more freedom within their tiny homes, while those with the most were being scrutinized in their own beds. Looking back, perhaps the quiet smile of a peasant on a straw mattress is the truest symbol of quiet resistance. Because even in a world of rules and fear, that simple closeness survived, nourishing love, nourishing life, and proving that no authority could ever fully control the most basic human need, to be held. In the medieval mind, intimacy was never just a matter between two people. It was always watched by unseen eyes, the eyes of God, the saints, the community, and most of all, the quiet fear inside each soul. To make love on the wrong day wasn't just breaking a rule, it was planting a seed of sin that might grow into tragedy. If a child was born sickly, underweight, or worse, didn't survive, whispers would begin. They didn't abstain during Lent. God took the child's health in punishment. There was never proof, but the belief carried more weight than any medicine. A natural misfortune became a moral sentence, and the parents carried that invisible shame, sometimes for life. Imagine a peasant couple. They owned little more than a mud wall, a patch of land, a few chickens. In winter, with the fire fading, the children curled under straw. They turned to each other for warmth. But if a baby was born in September, the village knew it had been conceived during Lent. They couldn't control themselves. Someone would whisper. So God took the child's strength. No one could prove anything. But the fear, it lingered. Even happiness became something to be ashamed of. Among nobles, the fear cut even deeper. A weak child didn't just bring sorrow, it threatened inheritance, alliances, the future of a house, and suspicion always pointed to the mother. She must not have been pious enough. She must have let desire outrun duty. Records even mention noblewomen scolded by priests or insulted at banquets simply because their child was not healthy. In a world ruled by grace and sin, even a baby's body became evidence of obedience or transgression. But the guilt didn't end with gossip. It worked its way into the heart. Those who had been too close on a forbidden day would go to confession, weighed down by dread. They knelt, they whispered, and they were judged. Maybe it was just a few extra prayers, maybe a period of abstinence, but the true punishment was the feeling that they had broken something sacred, that what came naturally was now a broken bridge between them and God. So, private life became a battlefield between two forces, desire and guilt. Some priests even wrote in their manuals that sick children were public punishments for disobedient parents. From the pulpit, this message echoed, the human body is a canvas, and God writes blessings or punishments upon it. No, but this kind of control wasn't unique to medieval Europe. In Islam, the holy month of Ramadan requires fasting not only from food and drink, but from intimacy, from dawn until dusk. Breaking that fast is seen as defiling the month's purity. In Judaism, the laws of Niddah forbid physical closeness during a woman's menstrual cycle, a religious rhythm woven into domestic life. In Hinduism, there are designated times considered impure when couples are expected to abstain. But what links all these cultures is a shared belief. The human body does not fully belong to the individual. it is also subject to God, to rules, to the gaze of the community. Even the most natural act can become a symbol of virtue or of shame. And with that belief comes a quiet burden. One wrong night can leave a shadow that lasts for years. Well, but here is the human truth. Where there are people, there is longing. And where there is longing, there are rules trying to tame it. Whether in a mud-walled home in Europe, a Jewish household in Jerusalem, a Muslim family during Ramadan, or a Hindu couple obeying sacred calendars, the pressure is the same. The rules are different. The tension is universal. So whether the house is made of stone or clay, whether the prayers are in Latin, Hebrew, or Sanskrit, people have always lived with the same quiet dilemma: how to stay faithful, without losing each other. Some whispered, some confessed, some found clever ways to slip through the cracks, but always they lived, they loved, they reached out in the dark and held each other close. In the silence of medieval villages, in the hush of a confessional, in the flicker of candlelight beneath the cross, we find a story shared across cultures, across centuries, that no matter the rules, people still found their way back to each other. But even after obeying the forbidden calendar, after whispering every prayer, after kneeling in confession, the medieval soul still lived beneath a sky thick with rumor and myth. The church walls could not contain the imagination. The bishop's ledgers, heavy with ink and judgment, could not silence the stories whispered at market stalls. Beyond the laws there lingered shadows, mysterious, half-believed things, chastity belts which many insisted were real, brothels openly licensed by local authorities, strange herbs and secret brews said to stop new life from taking hold, and rumors so sharp they could turn a single stolen kiss into a scandal that swallowed the whole village. From strict commandments we step into a different world, one of soft edges and shifting truth, where fact and folklore drift together like wood smoke in a winter room. In modern imagination, perhaps no image of the Middle Ages is more haunting than the chastity belt. People picture cold iron frames, locked tightly around a woman's body, the only key carried off to war 1,000 miles away by a departing husband. It appears in films, in comic books, even in tourist shops, a symbol both absurd and unsettling, a kind of punchline for how the medieval world supposedly chained the female body. And yet, when we look closely at the historical evidence, this picture begins to fade. The so-called chastity belts, the ones everyone thinks were real, very likely never existed in everyday medieval life. What we know about them comes mostly from much later collections, from the Renaissance and especially the Victorian era. In a few European museums you can find iron belts with heavy locks and even metal spikes. But most historians agree these were never practical tools used in the 12th or 13th centuries. They were likely later inventions, parodies, museum curiosities, or physical punchlines to myths already circulating. Rather than devices of control in the Middle Ages, they reflect later generations' obsessions with a dark past they themselves helped to invent. Open any medieval manuscript. They record all sorts of details, from recipes to taxes to bedroom customs, but you will find no mention of women forced to wear such devices. No blacksmith advertised these as special commissions. No church law listed them. No bishop recorded handing over a key before witnesses. And most of all, they simply weren't practical. Imagine wearing a rusting iron frame for weeks, months, even years. In a time when even basic hygiene was a luxury, a metal belt locked around the body would lead to infections, injuries, and possibly death. A society that depended on childbirth for both labor and legacy could not afford to maim half its population. The widespread idea of medieval chastity belts, then, doesn't come from reality. It comes from satire, from later anxieties and fantasies. During the Renaissance, artists poked fun at jealous husbands and absurd forms of control. In Victorian times, as Europe defined itself as modern and enlightened, the Middle Ages became their Dark Age, a cautionary tale of ignorance and repression. Chastity belts became museum props, symbols of how far civilization had come. Visitors in the 19th century would shudder at the sight, then walk away thankful they lived in an age of progress. But this myth has stayed with us because it's simple. It gives repression a clear physical shape, a locked belt, cold metal, an image you can't unsee. It's easier to picture that than to confront the subtler tools of control: honor, religion, gossip, economic dependence. In truth, medieval women didn't need iron locks to be held in place. They were bound by marriage contracts, family deals, and the harsh economics of survival. A peasant girl might be married off in exchange for a cow. A noblewoman might be unable to leave a cruel husband, because their marriage sealed a fragile peace between dynasties. In these cases, chastity belts would have been redundant, a cruel joke arriving too late. And this myth isn't unique to Europe. In China, stories tell of jade belts and invisible punishments for unfaithful women. In India, harsh purity codes were sometimes turned into sacred symbols. But like the European version, evidence for these devices is scarce. Everywhere, humans seem to turn social control into exaggerated physical metaphors, because myths are easier to carry than complicated truths. So when we speak of chastity belts today, we're not just talking about iron and locks, we're talking about the stories later generations told themselves to mock, to moralize, to celebrate their modernity. It's a funhouse mirror held up to the past, stretching some parts, shrinking others, until the reflection looks familiar. Not because it's accurate, but because it flatters the one holding the mirror. And that is why this myth survives, not in medieval bedrooms, but in movies, souvenirs, and whispered bedtime stories. If you were to step into a European town in the 14th or 15th century, amid the cramped taverns, the clamour of market days, and the sharp cries of fishmongers, you'd find a particular street that everyone in town knew. There, small wooden houses stood tightly packed. Their windows were covered with heavy cloth, and on the outside hung a quiet sign, perhaps a red lantern, a coloured cloth, or even just a carved symbol on the door. This was the brothel, an unspoken but enduring part of medieval urban life. What surprises many modern readers is that while the church publicly condemned such places, local governments often legalized them and even regulated them closely. Not out of support for personal freedom, but because they believed society would be more chaotic without a place to release energy. In many cities, town councils went so far as to set opening hours, control prices, and collect taxes regularly from brothels. Records from Nuremberg, Germany, show that each brothel had to pay a weekly tax, and the manager, often with flowery titles like Keeper of Public Women, was held responsible for keeping things orderly. It sounds dignified, but in practice it was a job as heavy as it was delicate, to please the authorities, keep rowdy customers in check, and soothe the concerns of nervous neighbors. Not exactly a line one could proudly add to a resume. In 14th century Paris, red light districts were usually placed near the Seine, easy to monitor and easy to isolate if needed. Brothels couldn't operate around the clock. Hours were strictly regulated, often limited to evening times. Some places required the workers to wear special clothing in public, usually yellow garments or brightly striped dresses, to distinguish them from respectable women, a kind of uniform serving both as a form of control and a way for passers-by not to confuse them. For the women themselves, life in this trade wasn't always the endless tragedy people now imagine. Some chose it because there were no other options. Widows without support, abandoned women, or those hoping to earn a fast living in the city. But others saw it as a practical job, steady clients, regular income, and more importantly, some form of legal protection. Of course, danger was always present: disease, violence, social stigma. But at least they weren't completely outside the law. Their customers came from every corner of society. A blacksmith just off the forge, an apprentice fresh from the workshop, a merchant passing through, and sometimes those from the clergy, men who, at least on paper, were not supposed to be there. Many court records describe clerics caught in red light districts, and the most common response from officials was to look the other way, so long as taxes were paid. Interestingly, many cities drafted hygiene rules for brothels. Clients had to bathe before entering. Bed linens had to be changed at least weekly. In some cases, physicians were hired to conduct regular health checks on the workers to prevent outbreaks. Crude as they were, these measures were among Europe's earliest forms of public health policy. Yet the brothel, in people's minds, was more than just a business. It became a source of endless anecdotes, rumors, and jokes. Some spoke of a merchant who paid in dried onions, others of a knight who left his armor at the door only to find it gone by morning. And of course, there were tales of husbands arriving only to discover their village priest already inside the same room. From a modern perspective, legalizing brothels may seem shocking, but in the medieval context it was a pragmatic solution. Authorities didn't want to deal with waves of assault, jealousy-fueled revenge, or scandals that might shake public order. They believed that by containing such needs within a controlled district, society would remain more stable. Brothels became pressure valves in a world already straining under the weight of hunger, war, and plague. Even so, the women remained heavily stigmatized. They were treated as sinners, excluded from many aspects of communal life, and often barred from returning to respectable society. Some towns explicitly forbade them from attending weddings in church, from serving as godmothers at baptisms, and when they died, they were buried in separate graveyards, far from the rest of the town. This reveals a deep contradiction. On one hand, society needed them to maintain order. On the other, it rejected them as stains on its conscience. In many ways, the medieval brothel was both public and secret. Everyone knew, and everyone pretended not to. They existed at the margins of morality, but at the center of social reality. And if you look closely, this logic isn't so different from many other cultures. In China, there were courtesan houses that coexisted with strict Confucian values. In Japan, the yukaku, licensed pleasure districts, were a staple of Edo's urban landscape. In India, the Devadasi system tied to temple rituals also bore the weight of commerce. It seems that wherever societies grow large and complex, people find ways to both control and permit these shadowed corners of life. So when we speak of medieval brothels, we're not just describing a row of shuttered houses, we're describing a semi-public, semi-hidden system where law, economy, morality, and human need intertwine. It reminds us that history isn't only shaped by battles or beliefs, but by the quiet, awkward, often painful details of everyday life. And through the steady rhythm of the past, we hear both the sighs and the small, knowing laughter, the sound of a business everyone knows, but few will ever name aloud. In the medieval world, childbirth was both a joy and a fear. A joy because a child could bring hope to a family, one more hand to help in the fields, one more voice to sing lullabies by the fire. But also a fear because every pregnancy meant danger for the mother, and every new baby meant another mouth to feed in winters where food was already scarce. That's why even in a society where the church condemned any form of birth control, people quietly experimented with every idea they could imagine to limit the number of children they brought into the world. And the world of medieval birth control was as creative as it was unusual. Among both medical texts and folk remedies, one of the most frequently mentioned herbs was pennyroyal, a type of wild mint with a sharp smell and bitter taste. People believed that drinking a decoction of pennyroyal could reduce the flow of humours and prevent conception. Some midwives advised women to mix a few drops of pennyroyal oil into wine, though in truth it was highly toxic when overdosed. In many manuscripts, pennyroyal appeared as something both respected and feared, like a guest everyone wanted to invite, but no one dared sit too close to. Another herb, better known in ancient times but almost gone by the Middle Ages, was silphium, once the treasure of Cyrene in North Africa during Roman times. It was considered a miracle contraceptive, so much so that its image was stamped onto coins. But due to overharvesting, by the time of the medieval period, silphium existed only in books, a lost dream. People whispered that if silphium were ever found again, it would be worth more than gold, for it was said to prevent pregnancy and cure nearly everything else. In folklore, it became a kind of magical plant, a story about a perfect medicine that vanished forever. Aside from pennyroyal and more common herbs like rue, juniper, and savin, many other methods relied on strange concoctions. One recipe advised, boil wine with beaver testicles and drink before intercourse. Another instructed women to use ashes from old shoes mixed with wine and drink it for 3 days. Effectiveness? Let's say no one could vouch for it. But in desperation, people often try anything that gives even the faintest glimmer of hope. It wasn't just herbs. Charms and talismans were also used as a kind of invisible shield. Some women carried amulets, tiny trinkets engraved with sacred letters, or scraps of paper with Bible verses tied around the wrist or hidden in the bodice. The belief wasn't just medical, it was spiritual. If a child could be seen as a burden or even a misfortune, then the charm was a way to plead with the divine. Please, give me a little more time. Some methods went even further, tiptoeing the line between superstition and comedy. One instruction read, after intercourse, jump up and squat 3 times, then sneeze forcefully. Others advised the woman to run around the house 7 times and clap 3 times facing north. These bizarre suggestions showed something important. A lack of biological knowledge gave imagination free rein, but they also revealed a real desire, the wish to have control over one's body, even if the tools were absurd. To the church, all such attempts were sinful. It taught that the sole purpose of marriage was procreation, and any attempt to block it was against nature. Many sermons repeated that to prevent pregnancy was to defy God's will. But life said otherwise. A poor family with 5 or 6 children and a long, cold winter ahead didn't always have room for theological reflection. They chose the practical path, try to avoid one more mouth to feed, even if it meant secrecy or sin in the eyes of the priest. What's notable is that many of these folk methods were passed down by midwives, elder women with knowledge of herbs and a role somewhere between healer and local doctor. They were the keepers of secrets, the ones who knew which leaves could ease stomach cramps, which roots might delay a woman's cycle, and how to speak so a husband wouldn't grow suspicious. In a society dominated by men, their role was a quiet kind of power. When we look at other civilizations, we find surprising similarities. In ancient Egypt, one recipe advised using a mix of honey and crocodile dung as a kind of physical barrier. Disgusting, yes, but the idea was clear. Create a layer to stop conception. In Rome, people used pomegranate seeds, believing them symbolic, because the goddess Persephone was bound to the underworld by eating them. In India, Ayurvedic medicine recommended neem oil. In China, herbal blends of ginseng, cinnamon, and turmeric were passed down as remedies. All of them reflect one shared truth: wherever there are people, there is the desire to control reproduction. While the church wrote thick books of prohibition, ordinary people wrote folklore and recipes. One side rooted in theology, the other in survival. And in the gap between the two, individuals had to make quiet choices. In the shadows of thatched cottages, behind rough linen curtains in rented rooms. Looking back, many of these methods were clearly ineffective, even dangerous. But if we set aside modern science, we can see in them a history of persistence and longing. They show that medieval men and women weren't simply passive followers of the church. They had needs, they had creativity, and they had the courage to try, whether that meant drinking bitter tea, carrying a tiny charm, or whispering instructions from a midwife. In the hushed corners of history, we hear this truth. Humans have always tried to shape their fate, even when all they had were leaves, scraps of parchment, and a fragile thread of belief. And that's the humanity of history, not just kings, wars, or cathedrals, but the small, private decisions in the bedroom, where joy, fear, and the responsibility of creating life all met, often in silence. In the small communities of medieval Europe, news didn't need letters or church bells to travel. All it took was a door quietly opening, smoke rising at an unusual hour, or footsteps echoing after prayers. And just like that, the village had something to talk about. Of all the whispers that circled through the air, none were as persistent as those about love, and the mistakes made before marriage. Why was that? Because a medieval village was small, and there wasn't much to do. No theatres, no televisions, no newspapers. What remained was the neighbour's tongue. A tender glance exchanged at the well could stir gossip for days. A young couple disappearing behind a tree line could inspire the elders to weave entire sagas, longer than the Sunday hymn. In truth, premarital intimacy wasn't rare. It was common enough that priests and local judges had to invent ways to manage it. In many places, village laws included specific fines for couples who went too far. Sometimes just one witness coming forward was enough to drag both lovers before the church court or the village council. The punishment might be a fine paid to the parish, a few days of public labor, or worse, a formal act of public penance. In some villages, young offenders were forced to kneel in the church through the entire service under the watching eyes of the whole community, repenting for having moved too quickly. Yet in a world of hunger and cold, those fines became a kind of side income for the village. Historians have found parish records filled with lines like, "A couple paid 2 chickens for their offense," or "The other family offered a wooden stool and a basket of grain because their daughter was involved in a matter." As if these secret romances had become an unofficial tax, paid in goods, not coins. But punishment wasn't always the end of the story. Often, if the couple married afterward, all was forgiven. Historians call this marriage by consequence. When a girl's belly began to show, her parents had few choices left but to pressure the boy into marrying her. Whether they loved each other or not, the wedding would happen, usually hastily, with little wine, few songs, and many long sighs. Sometimes, to avoid scandal, families turned to hand fasting, a spoken betrothal, seen as strong enough to let 2 people live together before an official church wedding. A hand fasting might be nothing more than holding hands before witnesses, often an elder of the village. If the young couple declared, "We belong to each other," the community would temporarily treat them as married. It created a kind of grey zone, not quite legal in the eyes of the church, but not shameful in the eyes of the neighbours either. Folk stories speak of hand fastings held in the forest, under the moonlight, with only a few close friends present. They would exchange promises, then return to the village and live as husband and wife. In some regions, a hand fasting followed by children was even accepted as a valid form of marriage. It shows that even within a tightly watched society, communities found ways to balance the church's strict ideals with the very real demands of everyday life. Of course, not all went smoothly. Some couples separated after hand fasting, sparking disputes over dowries. Others held secret hand fastings only to be forced into different marriages later, leading to lawsuits. These conflicts kept church courts busy, trying to judge whether a spoken promise had legal weight. Sometimes one witness was enough to force a couple into marriage, even if one of them had already changed their mind. What's striking is how gossip and hand fasting gave medieval love a very human shape, not as romantic as troubadour songs, nor as cold as aristocratic contracts. It lived somewhere in between, in clumsy touches, rushed promises, and weddings held just in time. And in that awkwardness, history becomes more familiar. Looking further afield, we find similar patterns in other cultures. In China, the tradition of shotgun weddings existed too. When a girl became pregnant out of wedlock, the community pushed the man to marry quickly to save face. In Japan, the Mii matchmaking system sometimes led to hurried marriages if boundaries were crossed too soon. In parts of Africa, the tradition of bride wealth allowed dowries to be paid after fertility had been proven. All of this suggests one simple truth: love before marriage, no matter the time or place, has always existed in that grey space between law and instinct. And people, in every era, have sometimes lost control, while their communities crafted ways to punish, forgive, and quietly profit from their mistakes. When we read old records today, we don't just find rules, we find a half-smile hidden behind the parchment. The smile of a society that knew, no matter how strict the sermons, the heart and body would always find a way. Gossip could travel fast, fines could sting the pocket. But hand fasting, a promise made under moonlight, reminds us of something plain and lasting. Love and desire have never fit neatly within the lines. In medieval European communities, a woman's virginity was seen much like a lock, something to be guarded carefully, closely watched, and if compromised, the cost was not just her own reputation, but the honor of her entire family. For men, on the other hand, chastity was rarely considered a standard at all. And that was the root of a double standard, a phenomenon not unique to the Middle Ages, but found in many cultures across the world. Among the peasant class, virginity still mattered, but not always as a matter of life and death. If a young woman became pregnant before marriage, the usual response was a quick wedding, or simply a fine paid to the church. There would be shame, yes. There would be whispers. But life went on. The child, once born, would eventually be accepted by the village. After all, in a world where labor meant survival, an extra pair of hands was useful, regardless of how they came into the world. But for the nobility, the stakes were much higher. A noble woman's virginity was a political guarantee. A bride who arrived pure meant the groom's family could be certain that any future child was theirs, uncontested, undisputed. A scandal could unravel more than a marriage. It could ignite disputes over land, break alliances, or destroy a fragile political treaty. And so noble girls were watched with relentless vigilance by mothers, wet nurses, ladies-in-waiting, and an entire noble class fueled by gossip. In some regions, crude and cruel methods of verification were practiced. The wedding night was not just private, it was evidence. The bedsheet from the first night might be displayed publicly as proof of the bride's purity. A bloodstain brought relief. The absence of one could bring disaster, legal action, annulment, even violence. An entire marriage could collapse over a piece of cloth. Modern science has long disproven this belief. The hymen does not always tear during intercourse. There are countless medical reasons why the sheet might remain clean. But in the medieval mind, those uncertain signs were trusted completely. Men, by contrast, were rarely questioned about chastity. A young man was expected to have experience and perhaps even admired for it. A noble son visiting taverns or brothels might be scolded softly, but it was never treated as a grave sin. In the eyes of society, the responsibility to stay pure rested almost entirely on women. It created a cycle of injustice. One gender burdened with expectations, the other privileged with leniency. And this injustice wasn't limited to the bedroom. It was built into the law. A woman discovered in an extramarital affair could lose her dowry, be expelled from her husband's house, even face public trial. Men committing the same act, unless it involved a powerful family's honor, were often let off with a warning. It was an uneven scale, and most accepted it as the natural order of things. Looking beyond Europe, this pattern is all too familiar. In China, under Confucian law, a woman's chastity was part of her family's honor. A girl who lost her virginity before marriage could bring shame to her entire lineage. Political marriages at court, especially those involving princesses, demanded absolute assurance of purity. Even in common families, parents would beat their daughters for stepping out of line, while encouraging sons to learn about the world. In ancient Rome, the story was much the same. Dowry and honor were bound tightly to virginity. A woman caught in adultery could be cast out, while a man's infidelity was often brushed off as poor character. The inequality was not just social custom, it made its way into law books. In India, the standards were even more severe. Marriages were arranged early. Virginity was not just desired, it was essential. In some communities, the custom of sati, forcing widows to die with their husbands, reflected a brutal truth. A woman's worth was bound to the man she married, and her purity ranked above her own life. When viewed in full, this double standard is not a footnote of history, it is a global pattern. Across Europe, Asia, and beyond, women have long been asked to preserve, while men have been forgiven, or even encouraged, to experiment. So what do we learn from this? First, that social norms reflect power. When power rests with men, laws and customs are shaped to protect their interests. Female virginity becomes property, something to trade in marriage and politics. Second, that control over women's bodies is one of history's deepest threads. Whether in a bloodstained sheet in Europe, a family law in China, a dowry in Rome, or a funeral fire in India, the pattern is the same. A woman's choices, restricted and defined by others, but history also shows us the cracks in the wall. Some women slipped through, with secrets, with whispered promises, with quiet support from family. Love found a way, even where law said it shouldn't. And that shows something timeless. Desire and the will to live freely are not so easily defeated. In the steady hum of history, the double standard sounds both foreign and familiar. Foreign, because we now see the injustice. Familiar, because its echoes still ripple through the present day, where gendered expectations have not fully disappeared. And in the end, perhaps the deepest lesson is this. History is not only written in wars and treaties, but in bed linens, in gossip, in the quiet anxieties of ordinary homes, because it is there, in those small, personal details, that we find the human heart, flawed, unequal, but forever yearning to love and to live truthfully. Chastity belts never existed. Brothels were legal. The birth control methods were bizarre and brittle, and double standards weighed heavily on women's shoulders. All of it shows intimacy in the Middle Ages was never simple. But beneath the laws, the legends, and the constant watchfulness, there was something deeper. Human feeling. Not everyone was just a subject of the law or a character in village gossip. They were lovers. They were husbands and wives. They were secret glances exchanged in the market, or trembling hands reaching for one another in the dark. They were hearts beating out of step with the rules. And when we talk about love, consent, or the tangled drama of infidelity, we see a broader picture. A world where people weren't just bound by law, but reaching, always, for some quiet freedom to follow their hearts. In medieval law, there was one idea that at first glance seemed progressive, even romantic. A marriage could be made with just two words, I will, said by him, I will, said by her. No priest, no church, no elaborate ceremony, just two people maybe standing in a field or beneath a tree looking at each other and speaking their vows. And that was enough. They were, by law, husband and wife. In theory, this opened a door to free love. But as history often reminds us, theory and reality rarely walk hand in hand. In reality, marriage was still in the hands of the family. A peasant couple might fall in love, but if their parents disapproved or the dowry wasn't sufficient, their I will meant little. Among the nobility, the stakes were even higher. There, marriage was not about two people, it was about two houses. A girl might be promised at 12 without any thought for what she might want. And when the time came, she simply put on the dress, stood at the altar, and recited the vow that had already been chosen for her. Even young men, while afforded more freedom, didn't always choose their fate. A knight might dream of marrying the girl next door, but if a local lord had a better alliance in mind, his opinion mattered no more than a sack of grain. These marriages were commercial contracts, dowries were capital, virginity was collateral, and the wedding vow was little more than a signature. The gap between law and life became clearest in court. Some couples claimed they had exchanged I will in private, with witnesses, and thus were already married in the eyes of the church. Sometimes the church agreed. Often the families did not. Court records describe lovers insisting their vow was real, while parents and elders argued it was childish nonsense. They claimed the couple was too young or that no proper permission had been granted. And sometimes this fragile idea of consent became a weapon. A girl could be pressured into saying I will in public, and once spoken even in a whisper behind a barn, those words could be used to trap her in a marriage she never wanted. Forced consent became another kind of chain. For peasants, things could be simpler. If two people worked and lived side by side, the village might quietly accept their union as long as it didn't cause scandal. But even that tolerance had limits. If pregnancy came before the wedding, a rushed marriage was often required. In those moments, consent was no longer a choice. It was an obligation. Among the nobility, consent could be used in another way, as an excuse to cancel a match. Some women managed to escape unwanted marriages by claiming, I never truly agreed. And the courts would have to decide, was that vow real? Was her will truly free? Sadly, the answer depended less on truth and more on power. Evidence was hard to prove. Witnesses rarely sided with the bride, and in the end, her voice was often drowned out by a priest's decree. Consent was also central in the world of secret marriages. Some couples whispered their vows in private and lived as man and wife until things fell apart. Then one might claim, I never said those words, and the other, left alone, would plead with the courts. The legal archives are filled with these broken promises. A simple phrase, so light on the lips, could decide the course of an entire life. From today's point of view, it's clear consent may have existed in law, but in practice, it was rarely respected. It lived more in sermons and courtroom disputes than in real village life. For most people, especially women, life was still governed by the wheels of family, property, and the church. And yet, in a small cottage, two people might still whisper, "I will," in the dark, knowing it wouldn't count in the eyes of the world, but feeling, in their hearts, that it counted all the same. In a castle's great hall, two noble youths might sit side by side at their arranged wedding feast, eyes never meeting, their marriage built not on love, but on land and legacy. So the story of medieval consent is a portrait in shadow and light. There was something beautiful in the idea, two voices, two hearts, freely choosing each other. But that beauty was often buried beneath duty, coercion, and gain. And yet, in those rare moments when a man or woman could say, "I will," and truly mean it, from the heart, not from fear, that was something more than legal, that was human, that was love. In the verses of medieval poetry, love shone bright, glorious, and romantic. The troubadours, wandering poets and musicians from southern France and beyond, sang of noble affection between a valiant knight and a high-born lady. In their songs, love was sacred fire, a force that drove men to war, to suffering, even to death, all for the chance to see a woman smile. Listeners, gathered around firelight or bustling festival stages, sighed wistfully, as if they too lived in a world where hearts chose freely. But that world was made of parchment and melody. Real life was very different. Most medieval marriages weren't about hearts. They were about families, sometimes entire territories, especially among the nobility, where land, titles, and power were carefully weighed. Marriage resembled a contract more than a romance. A bride might come with a fertile valley, a few stone towers, or a hefty dowry. A groom might offer military protection, royal connections, or access to lucrative trade routes. Love, if it came at all, often came after the wedding, and many times it never came at all. This created a sharp contrast between the ideal of poetry and the weight of reality. People dreamed of romantic love through the songs of the troubadours. But when they returned home, they still obeyed their parents' arrangements. That gap between dream and duty was as wide as the moats around castles and just as hard to cross. In some regions, the concept of courtly love from afar was treated like a kind of moral exercise. A knight was expected to remain devoted to a lady often married, usually the wife of his liege lord. This love wasn't meant to lead to marriage. It was admiration from a distance, a glance, a flower, a hidden poem. This wasn't real partnership. It was ritual, a performance of loyalty and virtue. Meanwhile, in the quiet villages, marriage was a matter of pure survival. A man had to prove he owned land, tools, or at least enough strength to work a field. A woman had to demonstrate she could cook, raise children, and maintain harmony in the community. Burning declarations of passion had little place here. A house that didn't leak and a flock that didn't starve, that was enough to earn a parent's approval. Love matches did happen, but they were rare and usually went against the grain. Some couples ran away, rejecting the anger of their families. Some farmers defied their parents, choosing each other for love, accepting punishment and whispers from the village. These small rebellions, when heard by the troubadours, were often spun into tales of romance, which only proves real love, though fragile, always found a place to grow, even if just a single flower in dry soil. Poetry and reality flowed like two rivers, running side by side but rarely meeting. In one, people recited stories of knights and ladies, of moonlight and longing. In the other, they walked into marriages without ever feeling their hearts stir. This tension often led to affairs, to scandals whispered across fields and dinner tables. But that tension itself was proof humans can't live on rules and duty alone. They need dreams. And poetry offered a place to dream, a world where love was beautiful, if only in song. Imagine this scene: a castle hall. On stage, a troubadour sings of burning passion. Below, nobles discuss marriage alliances, dowries, inheritances, the lute and the ledger, romance and coin. Together they formed the strange harmony of medieval life. To us today, the contradiction may be surprising, but there's something deeply human in it. Even in a world where marriage was a transaction, people still longed for love. And that longing left marks in literature, in art, and in the collective memory. In the darkness of a peasant cottage, a husband and wife who hadn't chosen each other might, over time, grow to care. They might turn duty into partnership. In the bright halls of a palace, a stolen glance between two bound by family might reveal something real, a spark of what could have been. So courtly love and real marriage were two faces of one society. One gave people permission to dream, the other forced them to wake. And between dream and waking, they lived, they endured, and they left us stories. Gentle as a sigh, persistent as history's heartbeat. Adultery in the Middle Ages was never just a matter between two people. It was a crack that could spread through families, communities, even entire courts. Because back then, as we've seen, marriage was never just about hearts joining together. It was a contract, a pact, a thread tying land, dowries, and honor into one. When one party broke the vow, the cost wasn't just emotional. It could lead to fines, public punishment, even death. In rural villages, affairs were often discovered through the smallest of signs: a stolen glance, a night away with no explanation, a scarf left on the wrong bed. And when rumors spread, they didn't stay inside the house. They swept through the village faster than smoke from a cooking fire. Punishments at this level weren't always severe, but they were meant to shame. Some were forced to stand in the town square and confess. Others had to pay a fine or hand over a goat, a sack of grain. These punishments didn't kill, but in a tight-knit community, they left a stain on one's name that rarely faded. Among the nobility, the consequences were far more serious. A wife caught in an affair might lose all her dowry rights, be imprisoned by her husband, or sent back to her family in disgrace. In some cases, the husband had the right to execute her lover, or, in fits of rage, even the wife herself. Things became even more delicate when inheritance was at stake. A child born of an affair could unravel an entire lineage, throwing land and power into chaos. Harsh punishments then were not just about revenge, they were tools for preserving social order. The irony, of course, is that while women were heavily watched and punished, men often received far more leniency. A nobleman might sneak off to visit a servant girl or make use of a licensed brothel in town, and it wouldn't be seen as much of a sin. In many legal codes, if a man had an affair with an unmarried woman, it wasn't a serious offense. But if a married woman was caught, she might lose her life. That double standard was hard to ignore and deeply unjust. But it was the reality of that world. Still, not every affair ended in disaster. Some were quietly resolved. If both parties were willing to move on, the community might offer gentle warnings, then let things pass, to avoid division. In rural life, where people relied on each other to survive, being too strict could destabilize the whole village. So written laws were often quietly ignored, as long as the scandal didn't grow too loud. In bustling cities where life moved faster, adultery could even become entertainment. Satirical novels and ballads often poked fun at stories like the wife of Mr. A running off with young B. People laughed, but they also shivered, because deep down they knew that joke might someday be their own life. Some affairs, though, couldn't be hidden. They became scandals, echoing through court and chronicles. Kings, queens, duchesses caught in forbidden love often paid a heavy political price. Some were dethroned, some had to flee, and some were reduced to whispers and rumors in the pages of history. In this way, adultery wasn't just about the bedroom. It was a weapon in the struggle for power. For the lower class, the price was shame. For the upper class, it could be war. That gap laid bare the deep inequalities of the time. A peasant girl might be forced into a rushed marriage just to hide a pregnancy. Meanwhile, a duke who strayed could be protected with a few burned letters and a quiet donation to the church. Interestingly, in many cases, the community preferred symbolic punishment over real severity. The guilty might be forced to wear their clothes inside out, be paraded around the village for ridicule, or kneel in church for a day. Just enough to humiliate and warn others. Like a sign at the edge of the road, "Don't go this way. You'll lose your honor." In rare but serious cases, especially among nobles, death sentences were carried out. Records tell of women hanged or men beheaded for sleeping with a lord's wife. But those sentences were rare, more for fear than for justice. Looking at the full picture, adultery in the Middle Ages was like a dangerous game, one where the prize was a fleeting moment of affection, and the cost could be honor, property, or even life. It was a game men often entered boldly, and women, more often, were forced to carry the punishment. And in the end, what lingers is the fragility of happiness in marriage back then. When love wasn't the foundation, when unions were built on land and wealth, private longing had little room to breathe. Affairs, then, weren't just sins. They were signs that people were always looking for a way out of their chains, even if the price was too high. In the sound of church bells each morning, in the glitter of royal feasts, in the whispered gossip of thatched roof homes, adultery was always hiding, a quiet part of life, never fully visible, never fully gone. And when we look back, we see clearly those affairs, large or small, reflected injustice, yearning, and human frailty. A story both sad and ridiculous, earthy, tangled and true, just like everyday history. In the tapestry of medieval marriage, where unions were often forged through calculation, ambition, and power, it's easy to assume that true love had no place. But the truth is, even amid contracts and the weight of family obligations, love still found space. Fragile, often unwelcomed, but present. And these small fragments, scattered across villages and castles alike, reveal the deeply human side of what might otherwise seem like a harsh and distant era. In the countryside, love often blossomed in the simplest of moments. A young man meeting a girl by the village well, where heavy buckets rose alongside light laughter. Or during a busy market day, where glances were quietly exchanged over piles of cabbage and salt. These were not calculated romances. They grew slowly, naturally, within the rhythms of familiar life. Sometimes they led to what we might call an elopement. Lovers fleeing together, breaking free from family control. The couple might escape to a neighboring village, swear vows before a priest willing to perform a quick ceremony, and hope that in time their families would have no choice but to accept. To many, this wasn't impulsiveness, it was the only way to be with the one they loved. There were love letters too, ink on parchment. Sometimes no more than a few clumsy lines, yet carrying an entire heart. Messages passed through friends, through wandering merchants, or tucked beneath baskets and bouquets. For nobles, The letters might be adorned with flourishes and verse. For peasants, they were simpler. Perhaps just symbols only the lovers could understand. If these letters survived, tucked away in monasteries or archives, they now stand as rare proof that love in those days wasn't just a poetic ideal, it lived in the ordinary. Even among the nobility, where marriage was rarely about love, there were exceptions. A princess who dared reject a political match, choosing instead a humble but sincere knight, a young prince who snuck beyond the gates to see the woman he truly cared for, despite courtly disapproval. These stories were often recorded with tones of reproach mixed with reluctant sympathy, for they disrupted the expected order. But perhaps that's why they endure. They show that even in cold palaces, hearts could choose their own rhythm. Strangely enough, love could even grow after an arranged marriage. Many couples, brought together only for land or lineage, over time found a quiet bond. Sharing the hardships of poor harvests, of illness, of losing children, they grew close. Not a love of burning passion, but of companionship, of care that bloomed slowly from duty. Letters exchanged during military campaigns or records of couples saving food for one another hint at a kind of love that was real and resilient. Sometimes love even challenged the rules of the church. There are records of priests who chose to look the other way and officiate marriages for poor couples deeply in love, even when families objected. These unions weren't always welcomed at first, but with time, a child born, a household built, they gained acceptance. In folk tales, love often appeared as a surprise, a shepherd chosen over a prince, a poor man tested for his loyalty, who in the end wins the hand of the woman he loves. These stories, though shaped by myth, spoke to a very real longing, the hope that love might triumph over order. Villagers would sit by the fire and hear them, catching a glimmer of hope for themselves. Even in monasteries, places of strict discipline, affection didn't fully disappear. Some letters between monks and nuns, written in subtle yet tender language, have survived. Whether spiritual or earthly, the emotions are hard to dismiss. They remind us that even behind the thickest walls, the heart still tried to speak. Seen through modern eyes, medieval romances might seem small or fragile, but they're what make history feel alive. Behind the battles, the land deeds, the heavy hand of the church, people still wrote love letters, still dreamed of fleeing into the night, still longed for a home built on feeling. And when we gather the scattered traces, we see that love was never erased from that calculating world, only hidden, sometimes forced into secret notes or stolen evenings. But that quiet persistence is what makes it precious. It shows that even in the harshest times, love still found a way to bloom, like a wildflower growing through stone. So when we think of medieval marriage, don't think only of contracts and dowries. Remember the couples who, in one way or another, truly lived and truly loved. Perhaps those rare and honest loves are what warm history's cold corners, and let us, centuries later, feel how far the heart can still reach. If we've made it through the entire medieval tapestry, the cramped homes, the threadbare curtains, the strict bans of the church, the awkward confessions, the myths of chastity belts, the legal brothels, the clumsy love letters, and the quiet affairs, we might be tempted to think of intimacy as just a small, scattered fragment of history. But when we widen the lens, when we connect medieval Europe to other civilizations, from Rome to Egypt, from China to India, we begin to see something else, that wherever humans have lived, in every era, they've searched for warmth. In ancient Rome, intimacy took on a different hue. The Romans were famous for their public baths, places where, depending on the period, Men and women could sometimes share space, bathing, talking, fulfilling a social ritual. Yet behind the marble walls, the hot and cold pools, private life still flickered. The graffiti left behind in Pompeii reads like an accidental album of love and lust, cheeky messages, suggestive drawings, awkward declarations like "Marcus loves Julia." Even in a society known for order and display, the human heart made itself known, plainly, sometimes playfully. Cross over to ancient Egypt and the rhythm changes. Egyptians believed the body was a vessel for the soul and that reproduction was tied to the balance of the universe. Tomb paintings show men and women wrapped in intimacy, not for shock, but as a statement that love, physical closeness, is part of eternity. Medical papyri like the Ebers, papyrus even recorded early forms of contraception, honey, herbs, even curious mixtures like crocodile dung. It might make us laugh now, but it proves something familiar. Even thousands of years ago, people worried about birth control, tried to balance joy with responsibility. In China, the picture grew more complex. Generations lived together under one roof, and bedrooms rarely offered full privacy. Husbands, wives, children, parents, even servants often shared a single connected space. So intimacy became a kind of silent art, much like in medieval Europe, where couples waited for quiet moments and timed their breath so no one would hear. Yet China also left behind a rich trove of romantic poetry. Tang and song verses brimming with longing, with absence, with the joy of reunion, proof that even under strict family codes, the heart still found its voice. People may not have freely chosen their partners, but they still passed on feelings. In a handkerchief, a blossom, a verse. In Japan, dreams were considered a doorway to emotion. In the Heian court records, it was believed that dreaming of intimacy could be a sign from the gods, a foretelling of future love, or a bond already written. Love then unfolded not only in daily life, but in the dream world. This echoes back to Europe too, where dreams were sometimes seen as divine messages, subtle ways to justify one's silent desires. In India, the image shifts again. There, sexuality wasn't merely controlled, it was made sacred through religious tradition. The Kama Sutra, often reduced today to a list of positions, was in truth a sweeping philosophy about love, connection, and the search for meaning through intimacy. In contrast to the rigid morality of medieval Europe, India built temples adorned with scenes of love, Khajuraho, for example, celebrations of harmony between body and spirit. Taken together, these glimpses give us a wider view. In Rome, love was scratched onto stone walls. In Egypt, it was buried alongside the dead. In China, it hid in poetry and ritual. In Japan, it slipped into dreams. In India, it danced across temple carvings. And in medieval Europe, it survived in whispers after dark, in stolen glances, in hurried letters, different in form, but sharing the same root. Everywhere, always, people have needed closeness. Not only to pass on life, but to feel comforted, to be connected, to drive away loneliness. From a distance, all we might see are the rules, the prohibitions, the punishments. But look closer, and we notice the small spaces people carved for themselves. A monk writing secretly to someone he loved, a farmer arranging a meeting after harvest, a princess daring to choose love over politics. These moments, fleeting, quiet, are the thread that weaves through all of human history. And perhaps that is the gentlest lesson. History is not just kings, wars, or decrees. It is also made of private moments, shy, bold, or simple. A hand held in the dark. These moments, however small, are where we most clearly see what people were, fragile, yearning, always searching for warmth. Wherever they were, peasant or king, cloistered monk or rebellious poet, people shared the same journey, the desire to be close, to love and be loved. And that is what softens the dryness of the past. What makes history feel familiar, like an old, warm blanket draped across our sleep today. And so, from the straw beds of peasants to the marble baths of Rome, from church rules to whispered love letters, we've seen how intimacy has always been tangled in rules, myths, and quiet defiance. History, in the end, isn't just battles and kings, it's also the small human search for closeness repeated in every age. Thank you for staying with me tonight on Historian Sleepy 365. If you'd like more nights of calm storytelling, remember to subscribe and return whenever you need the comfort of a sleepy historian voice, a space where boring history for sleep becomes your nightly ritual. Now close your eyes, let the weight of the day slip away, and carry with you the gentle reminder, even in the most complicated times, people have always searched for warmth. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.